Hi everyone, welcome to the next seminar of the New Project Seminar series at the Graduate School for Social Research. Most of you know me, my name is Bagra Barish, I'll be the host, which means I won't be saying much because today's event is devoted to the work of Andrzej Frelek, a PhD candidate at the GSSR who's going to present a paper, Matter and Pain, on Adorno's interpretation of Hegel, which actually is a piece of his PhD presentation. Hi, Andrzej, wave. Okay, and I also want to welcome and thank Andrzej's supervisor, Professor Szymon Wróbel, who's here supporting Andrzej. Hi. And we have a very special guest today, Professor Raymond Brassier from the American University of Beirut, who's agreed to comment on Andrzej's presentation. Hi, great to have you. Hi. So before I give the floor to Andrzej, I would like to ask Professor Szymon Wróbel to say a few words of introduction about Andrzej and his projects. Would you mind, Professor Wróbel?
I'm ready, yes. Okay. First of all, thank you for organizing this seminar. Thank you, Andrzej, for these years of cooperation. Thank you, Barbara, for chairing this session. And especially thanks for Professor Brassier for taking time for us and attending this seminar, which we appreciate all the more. We just read at the seminar on speculative realism his book Nihil Unbound, Enlightenment and Extinction, with a daring interpretation of Adorno and Hegel and Dialectics of Enlightenment. So it is a great pleasure for me that we can meet in such a wonderful team. Let me start by saying that I have known Andrzej for many years. I was supervisor of his Master of Arts thesis about commodity, form and labor, dedicated to Mark Fisher, capitalist realism and real abstraction of Alfred von Retter. And since I have no doubt that we are dealing with a very interesting person, a person with a scientific passion, analytic ability, and energy, drive for thinking. So with great curiosity, I'm observing the evolution of Andrzej's project. The initial title was Nature and Domination, reading Marx and Adorno in the Age of Climate Crisis. I can only say that this project is becoming, in my opinion, more and more philosophical and mature every year, and then more and more well thought out. I assume that Andrzej's main problem for today is how to read the complex relations between Adorno, Marx, and Hegel. How to arrange relationships in this, let's say, triangle. Who is the conceptual key to whom? And if I understand that Andrzej chose the strategy in which Adorno interprets Hegel through Marx. This is not the reading Marx through Hegel dialectics, but rather reading Hegel's phenomenology of spirit through Marx's Capital. I think that this is adequate strategy, but the key question is what place left for Adorno situated between these two prominent or influential figures, Hegel and Marx. Is Adorno merely a place of translation of Marx materialism into Hegel speculative idealism? I ask myself whether Adorno task goes beyond the task of translator, let's say, and someone who wants to save or rescue Hegel by Marx, yes. So the fundamental question is, does Hegel need any rescuing at all? Andrzej is looking for his own approach to Adorno, his own Adorno, an Adorno that is not necessarily melancholic or obscure. Andrzej calls this other Adorno minor Adorno. It is not Adorno from Negative Dialectics or even Dialectics of Enlightenment or even Minima Moralia. This is Adorno from lectures, I would say, more speaking than writing Adorno, if I could say in this way, particularly from Hegel studies. Perhaps this is enough for start. Thank you again for this brilliant material and for your presence today. I'm sure that we have a great discussion. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you for this. So now let's hear what the man of the hour, Andrzej Frelek, has to say on matter, pain, and Adorno's interpretation of Hegel. The floor is yours, Andrzej.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Professor Brasiut, for taking the time to join us and to read through my piece. Thank you, Professor Wróbel, for the introduction, and thank you, Barbara, for chairing today's session. Yeah, just in a bit of added context. So the way this chapter is positioned in my PhD right now is that I'm trying to go towards a coherent value form adjacent reading of Adorno and Marx. And I chose to do that through Hegel because I think Hegel is, for both of them, important for interpreting the capitalist society exactly through the value form. And only later we'll be applying this to the issue of climate change and the domination of nature. So yeah, this what I'm presenting today is a heavily abridged version of this chapter that basically presents most of it in just like a way shorter form. So yeah, I think I would like to share my screen with you so that you can follow along as I'm reading. Okay, does this work?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so I'll just start. So the relations of the entire first generation of the Frankfurt School theories with Hegel is rather complicated. It doesn't seem controversial to call Adorno the one who took the task of returning to this philosophical legacy the most seriously. His engagement with Hegel spans the entirety of his oeuvre, preoccupying him especially late into his life. It culminated in a series of books and lectures that touch on Hegel and on which my chapter relies. These are Hegel, The Three Studies, together with an introduction to dialectics, lectures on negative dialectics and history and freedom, lectures 1964-1965. These volumes provide us with possibly the most direct confrontations of Adorno with Hegel, all of them occurring during his preparation for the publication of Negative Dialectics, which can be seen as the culmination of this period. The task Adorno undertook was to ask what the present means in the face of Hegel, and to confront the claim his philosophy makes to truth. Adorno claimed that he wants to struggle both against the existing Hegel scholarship and Hegel himself, attempting to reconsider the meaning of Hegel's legacy and trying to rescue him where, to quote, only rescue and not renewal was appropriate, which meant facing up to his philosophy where it is most painful and wresting truth from it where its untruth is obvious. We will see that Adorno strives here towards a truth that might be hidden below the obvious untruth of Hegel's philosophy, below obvious criticisms. My reading of his inquiry therefore revolves around two questions. Why these excursus precisely? What is there to be found about the present in Hegel according to Adorno? And how are we to interpret Hegel from the vantage point of modernity? And two, is Adorno as close to Hegel as he seems to think he is? Or does one father figure masks two fathers? I ascertain that Adorno's desire is to defend his philosophical father figures as his method from the missteps of Hegel, the person, And to do that, he needs to turn to tools that perhaps betray his other allegiance. I see both of those as necessary to Adorno's critical theory, something that this presentation perhaps will to an extent show. So let us begin with this inquiry with the issues related to the dialectic itself. We come to the first part on what necessitates the dialectical process. As a process that involves contradiction, the dialectical method necessarily has to have a point of departure and something which stands in contradiction to it. When a dialectical philosophy of history is proposed, its choice of the point of departure necessarily informs the entire process. The point is what puts the dialectic into motion, and it also defines the terms of its resolution. In the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel says his intention is to go beyond the solipsism of Kantian idealism towards a historical understanding of reason. Hegel shows how the reflection of consciousness on its limits leads beyond the Kantian boundary to the social constitution of subjectivity and absolute knowing. The individual solipsistic consciousness comes to know itself as an individual, after which it has to undergo the process of mutual recognition, recognizing itself in another, to perceive that it is spirit. At this stage of absolute knowing, spirit recognizes itself as a processual self-reflection of the social universal on itself through its individual moments. Here, it is the universal that structures the cognition of the individual, meaning that it is subjectivity that constitutes reality. As Andrew Bartonek notes, Hegel says his idealistic philosophy gives priority to thinking over the material. Thinking is what forms and gives determination to the real. But in this, spirit becomes fixated on itself and begins to believe that what it encounters as the empirical outside is in fact its own. This is where, for Adorno, to quote, Hegelian philosophy claims to have gone beyond the opposition between rationalism and empiricism, to a point where it captures the spirit interpretively in its experiences of the world, while constructing experience through the movement of the spirit. Spirit achieves omnipotence as an absolute knowledge of its own demiurgic self. It is the primary intellectual recognition of the limits of consciousness that provides the driving motor of the Hegelian dialectic. This is what Adorno wants to contest. He claims that Hegel does not grant the content of the experiential substance of his philosophy historically, that he does not perceive the, quote, the compelling force of objective phenomena that have been reflected in his philosophy and are sedimented in it. For Adorno, the experience which inspired Hegel's dialectical thought itself is not simply the experience of consciousness reflecting on itself, but their experience caused by, quote, a recognition of the contradictory or antagonistic character of reality itself. The real starting point would be found in Hegel's own experience of history, of the radical upheaval in social relations brought on by the birth of capitalist society. Adorno says, the resulting diremption, the suffering of the world, become the sole sustaining element of the Hegelian dialectic. The Hegelian dialectic is as such not put into movement by logic. A contradictory epoch births philosophy that moves in and through contradictions, bearing witness to, quote, the former law of history that advances only through contradiction and with unspeakable suffering. Adorno goes on to explain that this suffering is not constitutive itself, but historical and related to social practice. He takes Hegel's idea of an internally antagonistic unity to be located in the principle of the moment of exchange, exactly as identified by the materialist dialectic, as Adorno himself says. Exchange is what comes to determine objective social processes, while being located in the matter itself, not on the logical plane of abstraction. But it encompasses a moment of abstraction, found within the practice of exchange, where one has to ignore the specific features of the objects to be exchanged in referring them to an abstract and common form, to the form of equivalence, to value. This abstraction produces a rift between human beings and matter, caused by an abstractness that comes to be in the act of, to quote, ignoring both the contribution and the needs of human beings in relations to the goods they produce, and which retains nothing but the common form which subsumes these goods. Here we observe that to produce his reading of Hegel, Adorno actually relies on Marx's critique of political economy. It is not the experience of something transhistorical, but of the coalescence of bourgeois society around the principle of exchange and the abstraction of value, which gives birth to the experiential substance of Hegel's dialectical philosophy. Just after elaborating on the impact of the principle of exchange, Adorno traces the relation between conceptuality and practice further, down to its social roots, which are practical, not conceptual. It is worth quoting the passage in question in full. The decisive experience of Hegel is precisely the insight that the world which we know is not something chaotic, which we ourselves first endow with some kind of form, and that the conceptual forms in turn, namely as a sediment of the history of mankind, are already contained in the reality we are attempting to know. But this presupposes that we grasp reality as something that is itself essentially marked or determined by human beings. It is determined not in the sense of the object of knowledge, as abstractly and purely scientifically constituted by the transcendental subject, but rather in the practical sense that the word philosophy undertakes to know is a word essentially mediated through human labor. End quote. Here, practice is the primary form of man's interaction with the world, historically constituting forms which mediate our interaction with the world. Here, human labor gives rise to conceptual forms, which in turn come to dominate human practice. This does not impact only what is human, but it also comes to define our relationship with nature, since those conceptual forms mediate all human interactions with matter. While for materialism, human practice mediates all experience and conceptuality, this comes to be felt as an internally antagonistic unity only when the relation to the material world is universally mediated by the principle of exchange, which forces a consciousness of the contradictions between the abstract and the concrete. Without it, bourgeois society cannot come into being, and neither can the principles of abstract universal human equality with which Hegel identifies the progress of human freedom. Adorno's understanding of the basis of the Hegelian dialectic locates it within the contradictions of this bourgeois society. This is a part of history to which Hegel is a prime historical witness and which his philosophy reflects. I have ascertained that it is by placing emphasis on human labor as the mediating principle that Adorno finds it possible to observe and critique the principle of the encompassing of the object by the concept, posited by idealism. But practice can only become an abstract universal if the social character of labor becomes abstract. Comes to a part on the reliance of labor on the material and the non-identical. At this point, we turn to a discussion of the way Adorno approaches the central concept of Hegel's philosophy of history, the spirit, and its relation to Adorno's notion of non-identity and its connection to nature. First off, we return to Hegel's dialectic of consciousness, within which he posits the I as a purely abstract and transcendental I. As Adorno notices, this necessarily cannot be, because an I that was no longer I in any sense at all, that is, without any relation to a spatio-temporal person, would be nonsense. If the Hegelian I were to be devoid of empirical content, it would come to resemble what Hegel himself critiques as the notion of a mediated pure being, that is, nothingness. Since this dialectic presumes limits that consciousness continually moves beyond, it necessarily requires an empirical person to whom that consciousness belongs. In positing an absolute, non-empirical subject, as Adorno says, Hegel's philosophy is untrue when measured against its own concept. As such, one has to ask what Hegel's notion of the labor of the concept designates. If spirit is falsely posited as abstract and non-empirical, therefore the moments of its labor also have to designate a non-abstract empirical moments. As Adorno writes, if spirit is to be real, then its labor is certainly real. To the question of the material substance of spirit's labor, Adorno gives a straight answer. The mystery is none other than social labor. If spirit labors, it is in the sense of an universal social labor through which society constructs itself and comes to be aware of itself. Therefore, the object is a result of the continuous process of subjective moments of actual social practice. What Hegel posits as unconditioned and absolute is as such conditioned or posited, requiring a material process for the realization of the abstract process of knowing. The possibility of positing labor as abstract in this way can only come, quote, from the principle of the equivalence of social labor, which makes society in its modern bourgeois sense both something abstract and the most real thing of all. This is a strictly Marxian notion. If the principle of equivalence serves to make objects commensurate for the sake of exchange, then abstract labor is the way in which society measures what it produces. It is the substance of value, abstracted from concrete practice. For Marx, this led to the products of human labor appearing as products of capital. Adorno mirrors this, describing the labor of society as one that appears to it as the, to quote, pure deed of spirit, spirit says as productive unity. Just as capital attempts to consume everything by reducing it to abstract labor, so is everything subsumed by the spirit as a totality which can exist only by enforcing abstract domination. Adorno sees here the irrepressible presence of the non-identical as the contradiction within the concept of abstract labor. It can only be the substance of value as an undifferentiated quantity, but for abstract labor to exist, it has to be derived from concrete labor, a process of interaction of a material subject with a material environment. In this process, a particular individual relates in practice to the reality surrounding her, this being labor in the full sense, which is in fact tied to desire, which it attempts to fulfill. This process binds the human being to non-human nature, to what is non-identical to concept, to abstraction. Adorno turns to the critique of the Gotha program to portray the relation of labor to nature as one where labor is necessarily dependent on nature for both the creation and usage of its values, of material wealth. Abstract labor cannot express this particular materiality or any qualitative characteristic at all. But the same labor which is posited by Hegelian dialectic as absolute and transcendental is strictly dependent on those material qualities. If spirit is to exist, it requires this sensuousness. It fits on it. Therefore, spirit forcefully dominates nature to make it fit the concept qua value, and domination comes to be the mode of its relationship with nature. Spirit obeys nature in order to master it. Even its proud sovereignty is purchased with suffering, as Adorno writes. When Hegel extols spirit as concept, he repeats the bourgeois celebration of labor in the form of abstract labor, of value that comes to enact compulsion on the society which relates to the world through its mediation. It is labor for the sake of labor, not for the sake of the negative process that fulfills desire. The error that Hegel makes lies in his own historical limitations. He conforms to the principles set by the bourgeois society and its mode of social mediation of both human and non-human relations. As Adorno says, it would take only the, to quote, remembrance of the simultaneously mediated and irrevocably natural moment in labor, and the Hegelian dialectic would reveal its identity and speak its own name as ideology. Adorno charges Hegelian metaphysics with reflecting a society ruled by the exchange principle, where production becomes production for its own sake. This is a state that cannot be kept afloat without domination, coercion, and antagonism. Seeing here a positive theology, Hegel effectively justifies the rule of capital over society. But at the same time, this is the way through which we come to be aware of non-identity. The consciousness of it appears when the principle of identity is set against the suffering and coercion it forces on humanity and nature, one that makes vivid the violence necessary for the sustaining of the totality. Here the concept of the true falls apart under the weight of the negative dialectical impulse, necessitated by the irreducible presence of suffering. What is necessary to think beyond Hegel is to follow the dialectic, guided by this negativity. This is precisely why Adorno judges Hegel for ideologically betraying the dialectical method while proving its true nature. He writes, if Hegel says his philosophy fails in terms of the highest criterion, its own, it thereby also proves itself true. The non-identity of the antagonistic, a non-identity it runs up against and laboriously pulls together, is the non-identity of a whole that is not the true but the untrue, the absolute opposite of justice. But in reality, this very non-identity has the form of identity, an all-inclusiveness that is not governed by any third reconciling element. This kind of deluded identity is the essence of ideology, of socially necessary illusion, end quote. By tracing the social disunity that is brought forth by social antagonisms, it becomes possible to show the truth inside the untruth of Hegel's philosophy. This process is necessary to uncover the preponderance of the object and the impossibility of harmonious unity, the essence of non-identity, which emerges unpacifiable in Hegel's philosophy. It is out of this principle that Adorno furthers his critique of Hegel by developing a critique of universal history, to which I now turn. The whole is the true is a sentence that has become emblematic of Hegel's system of philosophy. The movement of the concept, which comes to encompass all of its individual moments, clarifies itself into the absolute. As Adorno says, what Hegel understands by system, namely the entire and developed range of all the relations between subject and object, fully developed and clarified. The process in which the subject recognizes the object itself and perceives itself as reality creating is precisely what constitutes the existence of the system, which by its fulfillment retroactively recognizes the necessity and internal belonging of all its moments. In this sense, the absolute as system is actually identical with being for Hegel. In the aphorism 29 of Minima Moralia, Adorno inverses the Hegelian formula into the whole is the false, but he knows that the ultimate identity that spirit posits for itself is no illusion. Even if there is no reconciliation and no unity in the world, spirit nevertheless experiences the world as a system. This stems from actual social relations reflected in Hegel's philosophy, where the system swallows matter to ascribe it to thoughts in the same way in which capital fits on concrete labor, reducing it to the abstract substance of value. What the concept of system captures is the remorseless consolidation of all partial moments and acts of civil society in a whole through the principle of exchange, as Adorno writes. The thesis of totality is itself untruth, but it comes to be the absolute expression of the principle of domination, one that capital enacts on human and non-human nature. Adorno remarks here that, to quote, this idea of an objective social process taking priority over every subject, of a totality that comprehends not just all individual human beings, but all individual social acts, is in fact the implicit premise underlying the whole of Marxian theory, end quote. The concept of the whole is not simply refuted here, since that leads into relativity that presumes no objectivity. Necessarily, theory still has to reach for the whole that reflects the objective principles of social relations, even if that whole is false. As Adorno notes, this is why the anti-systematic becomes a complementary ideology. If society could be seen to be the system that it is, it would no longer be tolerated by those forced to inhabit it, end quote. Hence, his approach attempts to fuse the critique of the concept of universal history with critique of the rationality presumed by Hegelian philosophy of history. Because the system is a result of consciousness becoming the absolute, it proclaims itself to be rationality in itself. And because it is not the image of being, but being itself, therefore it posits that what is rational is actual. Adorno refutes this claim through a historical reading of Hegel, forcing it to confront the matter which it claims to reflect. He insists that the claim that the actual is rational requires the suppression of the constitutive individual moments of non-identity that are forced into an image of abstract unity. From the historical vantage point that observes the rise of the civil society, its antagonistic unity might in fact seem to be rational and progressing towards a self-consciousness of society as a unitary absolute. But from the point of view of developed modernity, the positive suggestion that the actual is the rational is no longer tenable. Adorno likens this to cynical frivolity and overweening arrogance, made obvious by the experience of Auschwitz, ascribing positive meaning to which could only be carried out by someone who has been, as he says, been made stupid by philosophy. Here the impulse to critique the concept relies on a turn towards the irreducibility of material suffering. But this resistance of Adorno's is not carried out by a recourse to irrationality. On the contrary, The non-identity between concept and reality should be seen as an impulse necessitating the critique of reason by itself. The state should become a further set of limitations, necessitating the process of self-reflection, which leads towards the consciousness of non-identity of mind and matter, which posits an actual limit to consciousness in the strong sense. A rationality that claims a full comprehension, full in the sense of unmediated, of the world reflects the bourgeois ratio that reproduces from itself the order that it had negated in the outside world, which, as an order that has been produced, however, it ceased to be one and hence become insatiable, as Adorno says, perpetuating its existence by sheer coercion. To understand how this ties into a critique of universal history, we should refer to the lectures on history and freedom, from which I provide here a lengthy excerpt. When Hegel asserts that history is rational, we must not hypostasize the concept of rationality. We must not speak of rationality in itself. If rationality, a concept based on an understanding of the self-preservation of the individual, ceases to have a human subject for whom it exists, it will lapse into irrationality. Hegel hypostasizes rationality and falls into the trap of thinking of rationality as the logic of things independently of their terminus ad quem in human beings. Here, the entire model of universal history as rationality has to come under critique because it reflects a state where the self-preservation of the system becomes a principle under which the particular is ceaselessly sacrificed. This disproves the notion of universal history as a continuous increase in the development of mankind. As the predominant rationality turns into unreason, it becomes a regression towards barbarism. Adorno does not refute objective history in a turn to absolute relativism here. Instead, he introduces the notion of historical discontinuity, seeking to conceptualize history as the unity of continuity and discontinuity, a process that does not subsume the particularity of the individual moments that come to constitute it, that does not believe in the notion of fate. This removes teleology from philosophy of history, while not removing historical continuity in the sense that, to quote, the historical situation in which we find ourselves is the result of prior historical progress. The past is set, but the future history is not predetermined. Each further moment can develop into progress or regress. The notion that there exists a necessary progress towards absolute freedom and unity is ultimately disproved by our knowledge that the entire planet is likely to burn in the result of an environmental tragedy caused by humanity. I want to note that this approach we see already in Marx, as he sees history turning against man by his own making, and the rationality of the system dominating all life, if not without a struggle. Adorno relies on this critique, and this is especially visible when he states that spirit is the product of human beings and of the human labor process. It is something produced by the reality of a life bent on self-preservation, something that postulates itself as primarily, only so that it may criticize existing reality or gain control over it, end quote. Here I would like to move to conclusions. I believe that we can observe that Adorno critiques Hegel primarily for creating a philosophical justification of bourgeois society. To do this, he relies on Marx's concepts that form the basis of the critique of political economy and his own critique of Hegel. If we understand immanent critique as a critique of an object on the basis of an inadequacy to its own terms, then I believe Adorno's critique of Hegel is not of such kind. But we shouldn't be tempted to posit that it is a form of transcendental critique. After all, he strives to go through rather than simply against Hegel. Therefore, I believe he reshifted the meaning of immanent critique from the usual logico-speculative notion towards a historically immanent critique. Adorno seems to agree, stating that, to quote, the content of immanent critique is the dialectic in history. The dialectic takes place within history, and the concepts by which it tries to grasp reality are historically specific, and as such, subjected to limitations that a given arrangement of social relations will mark any thinker with. That does not mean that the thoughts of this person are merely untrue. It means that they can become a mirror of society and its tendencies, hence the truth in the untruth. To understand Hegel, we need to read him again from the vantage point of our own time and measure his concepts against the developed form of social relations they were meant to grasp. This is why negative dialectics represent an utterly non-dogmatic philosophy. It never accepts any thought or state as immutably true, because only history can prove its truth. Finally, we return here to Adorno's question of what the present means in the face of Hegel. Firstly, I would like to note that from Adorno's vantage point, the reading of spirit as capital can be constructed much more vividly. With Marx, we are amidst the process of the antagonism between human agency and structures that dominated unconsciously. For Adorno, this battle has been lost and has to be refought anew. This isn't merely pessimism, it was actually lost. We should always remember that Adorno writes as a part of the generation which witnessed senseless massacres, the rise of fascism, and the Holocaust. It is also the generation that has witnessed the blooming of Capital's golden age after all that, and the mass adaptation to capitalist ideology. Therefore, in his eyes, the present becomes a perverse proof of the claims of Hegel's system. Secondly, for Adorno, Hegel still expresses the promises of modernity. But in the face of the concepts and values he ascribed to modern society, this society has utterly failed. Therefore, to think society in the face of Hegelian philosophy means to understand the truth in the untruth in the truth of this philosophy as the historical failure of modernity to rise up to its own self-image and promises. If Hegel is worth rescuing, it is because his philosophy carries within itself a negative impulse found in modern rationality, which allows for a non-dogmatic way of relating to the world, demanding the self-criticism of modern reason in order to strive towards those broken promises. As a way of concluding, I want to note that Adorno's reading emphasizes an aspect of Marx's critique of political economy that is immensely important today. It explicitly turns to the natural content of labor, meaning both the naturality of the human body as well as the non-human nature that labor works upon. Adorno is explicitly concerned with making visible that society's relation to nature is not transhistorical, but molded by history. What Adorno locates in Hegel's system is not merely the exclusion of material labor, but of matter itself, of nature as what stands in relation of non-identity to concept and value. Spirit as capital creates a world in which nature can exist only in shackles. This is a critique that we should apply and develop as we struggle against the climate crisis. And just as I'm pretty much done here, just as the last word, I think that what I forgot to put in is that I think that the interpretation that Adorno shows here, his interpretation of Hegel, is very much based on Marx's own, which I think also kind of repeats the errors Marx made. There were a lot of discussions since like the 80s that's shown that Hegel's system is not as idealist as Marx tried to say it was, and neither was it really so excluding of matter. And I think Adorno kind of repeats this mistake, but like this is something I'll go into more detail on in the chapter itself, but it's just worth noting. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think we could all hear that there's a lot of threads here to discuss. And I think the best way to kind of structure and untangle them is to ask Professor Raymond Brassier for some comments. And I'm not just saying that to be polite, but also because Professor Brassier is actually an expert on matters that Andrzej is working on. Professor Wrubel already mentioned his book, Nihil Unbound, Enlightenment and Extinction, published in 2007. But if I understand correctly, right now he's working on another book centered around topics of Marx, freedom, and fate. Also, his research has led him towards publishing on Adorno, Hegel, and Marcuse, as well as teaching courses on critical theory at various institutions. And his approach attempts to fuse together, which is important here as well, to fuse together the Marxian critique of commodity fetishism and Freudian psychoanalysis, while also drawing on Adorno and critically appropriating Hegel, which I guess in a way makes him the continuator of the work of the first generation of the Frankfurt School. So I guess if we were looking for an expert on what Andrzej is talking about, we have one. Professor Brassier, could we?
Well, thank you. Thanks for that kind introduction. Yeah, I don't think you know, this is I certainly don't feel like an expert in all this in this field. I think Andrzej's chapter is very impressive, and it raises, I mean, the way it articulates kind of Adorno's relationship to Hegel and Marx is, I think, original and one I haven't encountered before in the literature. And I also think it raises some very deep and vexing issues, which I'll try to kind of articulate in my comments. And I apologize in a way if I'm not able to, in a way, if my questions are convoluted, and I fear they are a bit convoluted, it's because the issues that Andrzej has foregrounded are very complicated, and actually it's he's dealing with some very deep, or he's exposing some very kind of deep problems in Adorno's relationship to Hegel and Marx, and this is what I'd like to focus on in my remarks. So I want to begin simply by citing, you know, two orienting remarks that Andrzej makes towards the close of his chapter, which is that to understand Hegel, we need to read him again from the vantage point of our own time and measure his concepts against the developed form of social relations that they were meant to grasp. And this is followed up shortly afterwards by this remark, where Andrzej writes that for Adorno, Marx does make the mistake of constructing a reversal of Hegel's system, making his philosophy of history not nearly open enough and subject to bouts of determinism that differs by being based on material development. That's on page 28, and the previous passage was on page 27, so right towards the end of Andrzej's chapter. So my question is, how does history mediate our relation to Hegel? And in what sense is this historical mediation supposed to be materialist, quote, as opposed to idealist? Because in a way, the opposition of materialism and idealism is one of the key stakes of Andrzej's analysis. So according to Andrzej, Adorno is a Marxist Hegelian rather than a Hegelian Marxist, okay, precisely because he emphasizes you know, the primacy, you know, of social production, social relations of production, which Adorno takes to be encapsulated in Hegel's account of you know, the logic of the notion. But if historically immanent critique requires grasping how what is untrue in Hegel expresses the truth of ascendant bourgeois society, then what distinguishes Adorno's critique from Marx's? For Marx, freedom cannot be realized so long as spirit is fettered by bourgeois property relations. Thus, human emancipation would be the emancipation of what the young Marx calls free conscious activity, which is to say of generic human life actively creating and recreating itself independently of the divisions of you know, private property, class, state, commodity, etc. So that once the development of productive forces bursts through the integument of bourgeois property relations for Marx, then social production geared towards the satisfaction of human needs could begin. So it seems that for Marx, history still harbors the germ of freedom, and communism for Marx is famously the real movement abolishing the present state of things and not an ideal an ideal state of affairs to which to which actuality is unfavorably compared. However, for Adorno, it is this idealist concept of freedom, even if inverted into Marx's real movement, abolishing material unfreedom, that is contradictory and hence a source of suffering and oppression. So Adorno writes in Negative Dialectics, freedom itself and unfreedom are so entangled that unfreedom is not just an impediment to freedom, but a premise of its concept. End quote. Thus, for Adorno, the combined horrors of the Holocaust and the Gulag reveal the untruth of this Marxian concept of freedom as the material inversion of spiritual self-determination. Social production geared towards social self-determination requires the domination of self and others, and both Nazism and Stalinism expose the murderous consequences of this compulsion towards social domination. And to the extent that state socialism and even perhaps the Marxian conception of communism, for Adorno, continue to relay this compulsion towards social domination, then it is no longer proletarian class consciousness, contra Lukács, that promises to break the spell of compulsive domination, but bourgeois self-reflection. So thus Adorno writes in Dialectic of Enlightenment, by modestly confessing itself to be power, and thus being taken back into nature, mind or spirit rids itself of the very claim to mastery which had enslaved it to nature. According to the famous argument of Dialectic of Enlightenment, it's precisely mind's compulsive mastery of nature, which simply repeats and reiterates this the compulsion of nature. So what's important about the passage, or what I find significant about the extract from Dialectic of Enlightenment I just cited, is that it is mind or spirit's confession of its own compulsive animality that releases it from its compulsion to dominate, and hence its compulsive animality. So with Adorno, it seems, spiritual confession and redemption, as when he, the famous remark about seeing, viewing the world from the vantage point of redemption at the end of Minima Moralia. He says these tropes of confession and redemption seem to replace, the materialist, the Marxian emphasis on struggle and revolution. And if the historical dialectic is the dialectic of myth and enlightenment, or of compulsion and reflection, then are the social relations of domination whose truth is revealed in the untruth of Hegel's absolute idealism, historically specific to capitalism, or are they merely the latest iteration of a trans-historical logic of domination? If for Marx, history is retrospective because, as he famously remarks in the Grundrisse, the anatomy of man is a clue to the anatomy of the ape, the anatomy of capitalism is a clue to the anatomy of pre-capitalist formations, is Marx's revolutionary conviction about the real movement of history retrospectively falsified in 1945, or 1933, or 1871, or when? When did the real movement falter? As I understand it, on Andrzej's account, Adorno is a Marxist because he insists that the truth in the untruth of Hegel's idealism lies in the way in which its logical relations encode social relations of production. Thus, materiality or social production is the truth of spirit. But then at the same time, on Andrzej's account, Adorno also turns out to be Hegelian because he insists the truth in the untruth of Marx's materialism lies in the way in which social relations of production relay conceptual domination. And thus spirit or domination is the truth of materiality, or social production as the domination of nature. For Auschwitz and the Gulag are names by which spirit recognizes its own self-mutilation. So in other words, if what separates Adorno from Marx is, the Holocaust and Stalinism, the atrocities of the 20th century, then it seems that there's this, Adorno's critique of Marx is also Hegelian. Is the truth not rather that Adorno is at once Hegelian and Marxist, idealist and materialist, i.e., one who exposes the materialist underside of idealism and the idealist underside of materialism? If so, then the question becomes, is nature in Adorno the named for an unresolved remainder, a third thing mediating matter and spirit, but which cannot be positively determined through either? And is non-identity then this third thing? Is nature the non-identical? And I think this is a difficulty. This is a problem. It's a question that's very difficult to resolve. Andrzej writes, when discussing Adorno's account of non-identity, he writes on page 17, the non-identity that comes to be known through the incommensurability of the abstract and the concrete in the concept of abstract labor itself, or non-identity manifests itself as this incommensurability between the abstract and the concrete in the concept of abstract labor itself. But this incommensurability is the source of surplus value. It is internal to the value abstraction. Labor is exchanged abstractly, but used concretely. And it's this incommensurability between concrete and abstract labor that is the source of surplus value, and hence the origin of self-valorizing value. So incommensurability cannot simply be pitted against value or the exchange abstraction, because the non-identity of concrete and abstract labor is encompassed by the commodification of labor. And there's a sense in which every commodity harbors this non-identity of the abstract and the concrete. But incommensurability presupposes conceptual commensuration, and Adorno is too Hegelian to appeal to an immediate or absolutized non-identity. It can only be conceived as the ineliminable residue generated by the necessary incompleteness of identification or valorization. In other words, something that is always, something which can never be, successfully absorbed by identification or valorization. And the question then is there not perhaps, an equivocation between concrete and material in this account of, of Adorno's relationship to Hegel and Marx? Because it seems to me that for Marx, labor is simultaneously concrete and abstract. The commodity is at once use value and exchange value. And this is the whole point about the logic of real abstraction. So in other words, it's not at all, and I think the problem or the limit of Sohn-Rettel's accounts of real abstraction is that it seems to be pre-Hegelian because it assumes an empiricist account of concretion, as if, you can simply kind of, the concrete, there is this concrete realm of use value, which is subsequently kind of, sublimated in the abstraction of exchange. And this is implausible, I think. It's implausible, certainly it's implausible for Marx, I think, because I think Marx is too Hegelian simply to kind of juxtapose the concretion of use and the abstraction of exchange in this empiricist way. And that's why I think Marx does not pit an originary first nature against an artificial second nature, because he recognizes that our relation to nature is always mediated by a historically variable ensemble of social relations. So nature penetrates history just as history penetrates nature. And Adorno recognizes this when he writes in The Idea of Natural History, a very early text, quote, second nature is in truth first nature. The historical dialectic is not simply a renewed interest in reinterpreted historical materials. Rather, the historical materials transform themselves into the mythical and the natural historical, end quote. So I take it that Adorno's point would seem to be that there is a mythical residue in spirit's pretension to autonomy, which Marx's subordination of spirit to social production or social materiality does not wholly expunge. But then the question is this a problem with capitalist production or with social production tout court? And I think the problem is that Hegel and Marx are refracted through Adorno here, but Adorno is not sufficiently refracted through Hegel or Marx. Subsumption is not a Hegelian word. And I think that there is a crucial disanalogy between subsumption under value and mediation through the idea. This is why I think that in a way that there's a sense in which both Hegel and Adorno emphasize the belatedness of philosophy. It's coming after some social transformation or revolution. And it's this, in a way, that conditions, when Adorno famously writes, you know, philosophy lives on because the moment to realize it was missed. I think that this declaration is more Hegelian than Marxian. So yeah, I'll just stop there. These were my just my comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Brassier. I think it's fair to give Andrzej some time to respond to your comments before we start the open discussion. But Andrzej, I give you like 5 minutes, no more, and I will stop you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. Like this actually clarifies a lot for me, and it's I think in line what I've learned since writing this chapter and studying the Marx-Hegel relation really closely. And I especially I especially think about this issue of Adorno's emphasizing the spirit beyond the relations of production and beyond social production and so this is something I think that's immensely important, and it's immensely important for my project. I mean, even this early text of his on the theory of needs, right? And I think there's a way to join Marx and Adorno in this, in emphasizing the changing character of social needs, this historically mutable character of social needs as possibly going beyond just material production and more towards like an idea of degrowth in the sense of having different needs and desires and not relating them so much to material and especially commodity production. And this emphasis on the moment of freedom and spirit is very important to me and very, I think, unique to Adorno. The other thing I would like to address, like on the spot, so to speak, is yeah, this somewhat, I think, this Freudian residue of spirit recognizing its own domination, confessing to it for itself. I think this is also a super important point, like, and this text on natural history is, I think, also extremely important. It's something I'm actually going to right when comparing Marx and Adorno, because I wrote an article on this this thesis on natural history in Adorno and Marx, and it's really interesting, this problem of whether this relation to nature has, to what extent it's historical and to what extent it has a transhistorical character, right? Alfred Schmidt, when he wrote on the concept of nature in Marx, wrote that the domination of nature will always be to an extent necessary. And I think this is something that this whole PhD project cannot escape from, because they will always have to use natural materials to like fulfill our needs and desires. And I think it has to be about, there's this point at which Marx writes that natural laws cannot change, but what can change is how they appear in different periods of history, or something along those lines. And I think this is basically what can be done with domination of nature. It will always be a necessary part of human interchange with nature, but the mode in which this is done can be changed. And I think it's the extent of domination is basically tied to the concrete historical mode of production and its goals. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're done, right?
Yeah. For now.
Okay. So I think it's time to start a discussion. If anybody from the audience has some question, now is the time, be brave. If you don't, I do. What was that, Professor Gruber?
It's only encouraged for you to ask questions. Yes, so sorry for this gesture.
I loved it, actually. Okay, so if there are no questions for the audience, you can still think why I'm asking my question. I actually have two, but we'll see how this goes. So my question for you, Andrzej, is this. Well, you're saying that what Adorno is doing is rescuing Hegel. And you're also saying that what he's rescuing is Hegelian methods, and he rescues it from Hegel as a person or Hegel's legacy. And concerning your own project of reading Adorno, you're saying that you're kind of engaging with Adorno's reading of Hegel in the way that Adorno's reading Hegel, which means that you kind of turning the table and you're trying to give him the treatment that Adorno gives Hegel, which sounds complicated because it is. But my question is this: is the method that Adorno uses the only things you're taking from him, or do you also have the same intentions? In other words, do you want to rescue Adorno? And if so, what do you want to rescue him from?
The answer to that is affirmative, in the sense that I do want to rescue Adorno. I mean, the predominant reception of Adorno in most of the discussions within the last few decades centers one around his philosophy or critique of culture, and secondly around his pessimisms or pessimistic Africa or whatever. And those are two things I'm like looking to rescue him from. There's been an interest generally lately in proving that Adorno is never goes far from Marxian critique of political economy. And this is kind of what I want to do, in the sense of proving that even his critique of culture has roots in Marxian critique of political economy. And this is in line with also trying to rescue him from accusations of this absolute pessimism, which I think like it's more fair to ascribe to him the Gramscian, optimism of the will and pessimism of intellect, right? So those are two things I kind of want to rescue him from. Working on that, like, kind of can be shocking at times, even like learning that still in the 50s, he wanted to write on a Marxist-Leninist manifesto with Horkheimer, which never came into being because they couldn't get along on that. And just the extent to which he follows Marx still, while never kind of admitting that. This is something interesting in itself, I think. But yeah, there's this side definitely.
Okay. Maybe somebody else has a question. If not, I have another one. Okay, here I go then. I think we need to touch upon the psychoanalysis bit in your paper, because your desire to use psychoanalysis is so evident. I mean, you talk about unconscious intentions, you talk about father figures, you use the word desire, and you say you use it in a psychoanalytical sense, and yet you don't use it. I mean, you don't use psychoanalysis, you can't mention psychoanalysis, even though you want to use it. So my question is why? Why don't you use it? I would go nuts Freudian on Adorno, really. Why don't you?
I mean, I think it would turn into something very different, and it would be really interesting, I think, because I definitely think Adorno's attachment to Hegel has this kind of psychoanalytic tinge of attachment to the primary father figure, because he never quite can get away from him. He absolutely tries to stab him in the back whenever he can, especially in his lectures, but he never gets away from him, right? From his early writings till the end of his life, he's just always like entangled with Hegel in a very, like, just say, complicated manner. And I think there is something here about in the sense of that's very kind of Oedipal relation that he has to Hegel, which I don't know. I'm never really much interested in biographical writings to this extent, but sometimes wondering about Adorno's relation to his own father. In this sense, but yeah, I just think this would turn into something else that would be interesting as a project in itself, because I think that psychoanalytic readings of philosophy are always interesting, but I'm more interested in just using some of those concepts here, because in the way that the critical theory of the first generation of the Frankfurt School has used it, right? Like the way this Hegel says this kind of affirmation of the bourgeois society is unconscious, in the sense that it's not meant to be written, but it just comes through the writings, right? And I think just those psychoanalytical concepts are very useful in writing critical theory, especially critical theory of philosophy. But the method itself, I think, would just take this into a completely different direction. Right?
Okay. Well, I also have a question to Professor Gruber and Professor Brassier. You both touch upon this topic. I mean, is there more to Adorno than Marx, or if not? Because what Andrzej sees, I guess, in what Andrzej is trying to say, that what Adorno sees in Hegel is Marx, and what Andrzej sees in Adorno is also Marx. So the truth of both of them is Marx. And he actually, in his paper, he poses the question, why not merely point to what Marx already wrote and be done with it? And this is my question, why not? You give many reasons, Andrzej, why we shouldn't do that. And those can be summed up, I think, in this way. Sometimes Adorno is more Marxian than Marx. But Professor Gruber and Professor Brassier, is this reasoning convincing to you? I mean, do we need Adorno, or do we even need Hegel if the truth of both of them is Marx? Professor Brassier?
I think that Andrzej is right to emphasize Adorno's debt to Marx, and that Adorno's fundamental concepts, his whole critique of, of idealism is, is profoundly indebted to Marx. And I think if you try to strip out Marx from Adorno, which some Anglo-American commentators try to do, you just get, as someone once put it, a disappointed vicar. So I think that Adorno without Marx is really not so. You have to negotiate his relationship to Marx. So then the question is Adorno's oeuvre just a meditation on failed revolution? Is it just a kind of a prolonged and really profound meditation on the failure of socialist revolution to occur in Europe, where it was supposed to happen? And I think there's some truth in it, and that doesn't make his work negligible. I think it makes, in a way, the value of his work would be forcing us to kind of, to see under what conditions Marx can be reactivated. And here, this also means defending Marx from some of the more nefarious caricatures that abound, because a lot of the criticisms, the dismissals of Marx rely on egregious caricatures. And then the question is, does Adorno, when Adorno tries to kind of distinguish himself from Marx, when he tries to kind of, go beyond Marx, is he also just caricaturing Marx, or kind of, ignoring something important in Marx? And the real question is about the failure. Is the failure, is the proletariat's failure to achieve this revolutionary self-consciousness, is this a failure of Marxism, or is this a kind of a historical accident? And I think Adorno is indebted to Marx, but I think, Mosch Postone has a really brilliant paper. Mosch Postone and Barbara Brick have a really brilliant paper on how the Adorno's critical pessimism, and which he shares with Horkheimer, is derived from the work of Friedrich Pollock, from a thesis about the transition from monopoly to state capitalism. Friedrich Pollock was a member of the Institute for Social Research, and he argued that capitalism had entered into a new phase where both America, Franklin Roosevelt's America and Stalin's Russia were variants of state capitalism. And it's this kind of new social form which makes revolution materially impossible. But then obviously, if Adorno's pessimism then would be historically circumscribed. In a way, he misdiagnosed the failure of revolution and then thought it was a congenital failure in Marx's analysis of capital. And I think that that's a mistake. I think it was the misdiagnosis is with the alleged transition from monopoly capitalism to so-called state capitalism.
Professor Wróbel, thank you.
Professor Wróbel, okay. First of all, I would say that I understand, of course, Andrzej, his intention and inclination to read Hegel by the vocabulary borrowed from Marx, and I even understand, yes, after reading the lecture about freedom, progress, and history of Adorno, the sources of such idea, of such temptation. Yes, it's rather self-evident where are the sources of the idea. The Hegelian spirit is the Marx capital. Yes. All this is clear for me, but I would prefer, and this is what I appreciate very much in the speech, in the comments of Ray Brassier, in the first round, the balancing, the relationships between Marx and Hegel. Yes, because maybe it is worthwhile to encourage us not only to see Marx in Hegel, but also Hegel in Marx, yes, to balance these relationships and seeing not only the moment of the materialism in Hegel, but the moment of idealism in Marx, yes, at the same time. Maybe this is the more just reading of these two prominent philosophers. What borrows me from the beginning, yes, what borrows me from the beginning, I said this, Andrzej, is the question whether the Adorno himself disappear a little in this constellation. I have the problem with the Adorno who maybe is not a teacher, a reader, an interpreter, yes, of these two philosophical schools, but Adorno who resist maybe more to Marx and Hegel at the same time, not only deliver, yes, lectures for students about these main ideas of these two philosophers, but try to describe, try to eliminate his own area, his own voice, yes, and this own voice of Adorno is here for me very important, and all this brilliant Andrzej interpretation is on the risk of disappearing of this voice, yes. Especially, I have many arguments, yes, about this. For example, what struck me very much, we talk about this with Andrzej, yes. What struck me very much in this project, it is the omniscience. It is the omniscience, and it even fact that Adorno, which is attractive, especially for me, yes, the Adorno as author of aesthetic theory, or philosophy of new music, yes, or many comments to literature, yes, Kafka, Hölderlin about parallaxa, yes, even Balzac, yes, all these many essays, yes, very sensitive, yes, very sensitive essay about literature, music, Schoenberg, yes, Mahler, and so on. Simply are absent in this work. Yes, what is very interesting for two reasons. Yes, first, if we know that Andrzej has very strong background in the music, yes, he is very well educated in music. This is the first reason which surprise, which is the cause of my surprising. And the second, yes, if we read this first version, at least Andrzej paper proposition, the crucial concept is the pain and suffering, yes. pain and suffering, pain and suffering. At the beginning was the pain. Yeah? There was the pain at the beginning. This is one of the theses of this dissertation, and which justify to use the psychoanalysis. This is exactly what justifies to use the psychoanalysis. Yes. But of course, if we agree that the pain is at the beginning, maybe we should not only discuss about this conceptual work, but, for example, to rethink the place of art, yes, especially music, literature, poetry, yes. In all this enterprise of Adorno, especially when we are looking for expressions, for the mechanisms or apparatus of expression of this man. So maybe this at the moment, yes.
Okay, you know what? I'm not gonna let you, Andrzej, respond to this because we're running out of time, but I have a feeling that you're kind of scamming us, and your whole point is not really Adorno. What you want to rescue is Marx, and what you want to see everywhere is Marx, and this Adorno bit is just, yeah.
You exaggerated it.
Yeah, of course I am. But still, okay, I'm not gonna respond.
He's very well educated, believe me.
I'm not gonna let anybody respond to that. I'm gonna leave you with that. I want to thank you, all of you, for being here and for a great discussion. Andrzej, I hope this was helpful to you. I want to thank Professor Wróbel, Professor Brassier, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure. Professor Fels, thank you so much. And I hope to see at least some of you in a near future. And I guess, bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all of you. Brilliant.